In a quiet, affluent part of town lived a man who few knew much about, and even fewer had ever met. He wasn't a celebrity, nor a local politician, and certainly not the type to host lavish parties or flash his wealth. In fact, to most people, he was a ghost. His name was seldom mentioned in social circles, and when it was whispered with curiosity and mystery. No one really knew the full extent of his fortune, and his origins were equally murky. Some said he had inherited old money, while others believed he had made his fortune through shrewd investments that no one could quite pinpoint. He lived alone in a sprawling estate, hidden behind tall iron gates, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens that only a handful of people had ever set eyes on. His interactions with the outside world were rare and fleeting. When he ventured out, it was always understated. He'd drive an ordinary car, wear simple clothing, and keep to himself. People in the neighborhood would occasionally see him at the bank, at the post office, or in a quiet corner of a bookstore, but he never lingered. He seemed to avoid drawing attention. Over time, people grew used to his strange existence, and he became a sort of urban legend. Parents would tell their children stories about the mysterious man with more money than anyone could imagine, who lived in a mansion no one ever visited. But despite the wealth he was rumored to possess, he never flaunted it. There were no grand vacations, no exclusive clubs, no interviews or photo spreads in magazines. Just a quiet, almost invisible presence. Behind those iron gates, the millionaire's life was one of seclusion. The estate was vast, and the house itself, though impressive in size, was devoid of the ostentation you'd expect from a man of such means. Inside, his days were spent in quiet contemplation. He had no known family, no children or spouse, no one to share his fortune with, and no heirs apparent. His business affairs were handled through trusted attorneys and financial advisors who spoke of him as a man of few words, but great intellect. Though he was never seen at charity galas or fundraising events, rumors circulated that he was a generous philanthropist, donating large sums to causes he believed in, always anonymously. What no one could have guessed, though, was how he had spent his final years reflecting on the fleeting nature of life, the value of human connection, and the unusual legacy he would leave behind. His interactions with the world had been rare, but there was one place where he found a certain comfort, a quiet solace that drew him back time and time again. And it wasn't a grand estate or luxurious getaway. No, it was a small, nondescript diner nestled on a forgotten corner of town. The diner was the kind of place that had been around forever, with cracked vinyl booths, a well-worn counter, and a neon sign that buzzed faintly at night. It wasn't a spot that attracted tourists, or even people from the wealthier parts of town. The regulars were truck drivers, factory workers, and folks just passing through. The food was nothing to write home about. Greasy burgers, black coffee, pie that was a little too sweet. But for the millionaire, it was a retreat, a place where he could blend into the background, unnoticed. Here he wasn't a man with unimaginable wealth, he was just another customer. The waitress at the diner didn't know anything about the man's fortune. To her, he was just a quiet regular who would come in, order a coffee and a sandwich, and sit by the window, reading a book or staring out into the street. She had no idea who he was, what he did for a living, or how much he was worth. To her, he was just Mr. Charles, the name she'd learned from the occasional scraps of conversation he offered. She herself was a hard-working woman, living paycheck to paycheck, and like many in the town, she had dreams, but they felt distant and unreachable. Every day she'd wake up before dawn, tie her hair back, and head to the diner, where the tips were meager and the hours long. Yet, despite the exhaustion, she approached each day with a quiet dignity. She didn't complain, even when the shifts dragged on or when she was treated poorly by the occasional rude customer. She was kind to everyone who walked through the door, no matter who they were. For her, the diner was more than just a job. It was a place where she'd formed relationships with regulars, learned their stories, and shared in their everyday joys and struggles. She'd been working there for years, serving coffee to the same faces day in and day out. Some came for the food, others came for the company. The waitress wasn't just someone who took their order, she was a familiar face, a comforting presence in an otherwise monotonous day. And though she lived simply, she found satisfaction in these small moments of connection. Mr. Charles, as she knew him, was polite but reserved. He never spoke much about himself, and she never pried. Their conversations were short and to the point. "How's your day?" she'd ask, to which he'd reply with a nod or a brief, "Fine, thank you." He wasn't like some of the other regulars who shared stories from their lives, but she could tell there was something about him that made him different. There was a quiet sadness to him, a loneliness that seemed to hang over him even when he smiled politely. Still, she treated him like anyone else, refilling his coffee cup without asking, making sure his sandwich was just the way he liked it. No onions, extra mustard. Over time, she noticed that he tipped well, not extravagantly, but consistently. A few extra dollars here and there, nothing that raised suspicion or hinted at his true wealth. Just enough to make her think he was a kind man. Little did she know, their small, seemingly insignificant interactions would soon change her life forever. The day started like any other. The waitress had just finished her early shift when she noticed the town buzzing with the news of a local death. It wasn't until she overheard a conversation at the counter that she realized who had passed: Mr. Charles, the quiet regular she'd served for years. She felt a pang of sadness, but life in the diner moved on. People came and went, meals were served, dishes were washed, and she didn't think much more about it. That was until, a week later, she received a letter. It was formal, stamped with a law firm's insignia, and for a moment, she thought it was some sort of mistake. Why would a law firm be contacting her? She opened it slowly, her heart racing as she read the words. It was a notification from the estate of Charles F. Whitman, Mr. Charles. She nearly dropped the letter when she saw the words, "You have been named the sole beneficiary of Mr. Whitman's estate." At first, she didn't believe it. Surely this had to be a mistake. But it wasn't. The mysterious millionaire had left his entire fortune to her, a waitress he had barely known. It was a fortune that would change her life forever, a staggering amount of money that she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Why her? She had no idea. The only thing she knew for certain was that her life, from this moment on, would never be the same. The day after she received the letter, everything felt surreal. The waitress sat at her small kitchen table, the official envelope still lying in front of her, as if it held a secret too large to fully comprehend. She had read the words over and over again, but no matter how many times she did, they didn't seem any more real. Charles F. Whitman, the man she had known only as Mr. Charles, had left her his entire estate. She tried to wrap her head around it, but the more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. What kind of man leaves his fortune to a waitress he barely spoke to? She spent hours pacing around her small apartment, the silence almost unbearable. She wanted to talk to someone, to share the news, but who would believe her? How would they react? She imagined the faces of her friends and co-workers, their expressions shifting from shock to disbelief. No, she wasn't ready for that. Instead, she kept it to herself, holding on to the strange news like a fragile secret that might shatter if exposed too soon. By the end of the week, things escalated in ways she hadn't imagined. The law firm handling Mr. Whitman's estate reached out, confirming the details of the will. They explained that he had indeed left everything to her, his estate, his investments, his assets. It was all hers. The number they mentioned was so large she could hardly say it out loud. Millions. She couldn't comprehend that amount of money. It was more than she could have ever imagined in her wildest dreams. It was a number that didn't seem to belong in her world of early morning shifts and barely making rent. And yet, it was now her reality. Soon enough, the news spread. It started with whispers at the diner, regulars who had heard through the grapevine that something strange had happened. A few patrons noticed that she had been distracted lately, her mind clearly elsewhere. But they never could have guessed the reason why. Eventually, though, the secret slipped out, and once it did, there was no containing it. The story of the waitress who inherited millions from a mysterious millionaire exploded, and it wasn't long before reporters and media outlets came knocking. At first, the attention was subtle. Local journalists calling, asking if they could meet her for an interview. They were curious about the unexpected windfall and wanted to know how it felt to have her life turned upside down overnight. She ignored most of them, not ready to face the world outside her door, still grappling with the enormous changes herself. But soon, the local buzz turned into a media frenzy. National outlets picked up the story, and before she knew it, her name was plastered all over the news. Headlines screamed about the random waitress who had become a millionaire overnight. It was as if the whole country was watching her, wondering what she would do next. Suddenly, cameras were camped outside her apartment building, and reporters waited outside the diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. They asked invasive questions, shouting over each other to get her attention. How does it feel to be a millionaire? Why do you think he chose you? What are you going to do with all that money? She tried to shield herself from the chaos, slipping in and out of work with her head down, hoping the attention would die down. But it didn't. If anything, it grew. For someone who had lived her entire life in quiet anonymity, the sudden fame was overwhelming. She wasn't used to the spotlight, didn't know how to handle the sudden rush of attention. Her phone rang constantly, with calls from strangers and acquaintances alike. Some were kind, offering congratulations and well wishes, but others were far less genuine. She started to notice how people around her began to change. Friends who had once been supportive and trustworthy now seemed to act differently. People she hadn't spoken to in years reached out, wanting to reconnect and catch up. Some tried to drop hints, suggesting they could help her figure out what to do with the money, while others were more direct, asking for loans or investments. Even her co-workers at the diner, who had always been close, began to act strangely around her. Conversations that had once been lighthearted and friendly were now tinged with awkwardness. People were careful around her, as if they didn't know what to say. They didn't treat her the same anymore. There were whispers behind her back, envious looks she hadn't noticed before, and questions she could tell were designed to probe her newfound wealth. The place that had once felt like home, the diner where she'd spent years of her life, now felt foreign to her. The camaraderie had been replaced by something more uncomfortable. The worst part, though, was how isolated she began to feel. Despite all the people clamoring for her attention, she realized that she was more alone than ever. She couldn't talk to anyone without wondering about their motives. Were they genuinely interested in her well-being, or were they hoping to benefit from her windfall? Even her family, who had always been supportive, seemed to treat her differently. Her parents, who had been proud of her for working hard and making a life for herself, now looked at her as if they didn't quite know who she was anymore. Her siblings started to make comments about the money, jokes at first, but soon the jokes turned into serious conversations about what she planned to do with it. The pressure was mounting, and she began to feel as though her life was spinning out of control. The attention from the media was relentless, and her relationships with the people around her were changing in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always thought that having money would solve all her problems, but now that she had it, she realized that it had only created new ones. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't asked to be thrust into the spotlight or to become the subject of everyone's curiosity. All she had ever wanted was to live a simple life, to work hard and build something for herself. But now, that life felt like a distant memory. As the media frenzy continued and the people around her became more demanding, she found herself retreating from the world. She stopped answering calls, stopped responding to messages, and avoided the diner altogether. She felt like she couldn't trust anyone, and the loneliness weighed heavily on her. The fortune that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a curse. She hadn't even had time to grieve the loss of Mr. Charles, the quiet man who had left her everything. Instead, she was being pulled in 100 different directions, with no time to process what any of it meant. Her life had changed in an instant, but the world around her hadn't slowed down to let her catch her breath. It kept spinning, faster and faster, and she felt like she was being left behind, drowning in the weight of it all. All she wanted was to go back to the way things were before the money, before the chaos. But there was no going back. Her life would never be the same again. As the days turned into weeks, the waitress's world became a delicate balance of uncertainty and distrust. She had never been surrounded by so many people, yet she had never felt so alone. People she had once considered friends now seemed to view her differently, their intentions clouded by the allure of her sudden wealth. Old acquaintances came out of the woodwork, each with a story about how they had always been close or how they had supported her in some way. At first, she tried to be polite, but it became harder to ignore the subtle and not-so-subtle requests for financial help. Old friends suddenly had business ideas, investments they were eager to get off the ground, and needed just a little seed money to get started. Strangers began approaching her too, sometimes in the diner, but often at her apartment, or while she was out running errands. They claimed to have heard her story and felt compelled to share their own struggles, each ending with a request for help. She felt trapped in a new, unsettling reality. The people she used to trust now seemed unpredictable. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt calculated. Some would casually drop hints about their financial troubles or make jokes about her newfound wealth, as though fishing for her to offer assistance. She even noticed changes in the demeanor of her family. Her siblings, who had once been her greatest supporters, started to act strangely around her, as though they were treading on eggshells. Their jokes about their millionaire sister began to feel less like playful banter and more like pointed comments. Even her parents seemed different, subtly implying that perhaps it was time for her to give back to those who had raised her. It wasn't that she didn't want to help. In fact, the idea of sharing her fortune with the people she loved was something she had thought about often. But she found herself questioning their motives. Were they reaching out because they cared, or because they saw her as a solution to their own problems? The pressure to make decisions about the money, combined with the growing unease about her relationships, began to weigh on her heavily. She couldn't shake the feeling that the fortune had created an invisible wall between her and the rest of the world, a wall that grew higher with every passing day. The constant attention became unbearable. Reporters continued to show up outside her apartment, and news of her inheritance seemed to spread farther than she could have imagined. She became a sort of small-town celebrity, and everywhere she went, eyes followed her. People she didn't know stopped her in the street, congratulating her or asking about her plans. Some were simply curious, but others had a more aggressive tone, offering unsolicited advice or asking outright for money. She felt hunted, as though she was no longer a person, but a symbol, someone who had more than enough, and therefore was obligated to share it with the world. In her most private moments, she began to reflect on her strange connection to Mr. Charles. It seemed so out of place, so random, and yet there had to be a reason he had chosen her. She had only known him as a customer, one of many she had served over the years. But the more she thought about it, the more she wondered if there had been something more to their interactions than she had initially realized. Though their conversations had been brief and polite, there was something about Mr. Charles that had always intrigued her. His quiet demeanor, his almost melancholy presence, and the way he seemed to prefer her section of the diner whenever he came in. She began to piece together their history, small details she hadn't paid much attention to before. There were moments when he would linger after finishing his meal, sitting in silence with his coffee, his eyes distant but thoughtful. She remembered how he would occasionally look up from his book and smile, a quiet, reserved smile that seemed to convey something unspoken. He had never been rude, never demanding, but there was a sense of familiarity between them, a subtle connection that went beyond the typical customer-server relationship. Had he been watching her more closely than she realized? Had he seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself? One day, driven by curiosity and a need for answers, she decided to visit Mr. Charles's old estate. She had never seen it in person, but now, as the beneficiary, it was hers. The sprawling mansion felt intimidating, cold and unfamiliar. It was a far cry from the modest life she had lived up until now. Walking through the grand hallways, she couldn't help but feel out of place. The wealth and opulence of the estate didn't align with the image of Mr. Charles she had known, the quiet man who sat at the diner counter, drinking black coffee and reading books. But as she explored the rooms, she found clues to who he really was. There were shelves lined with books about philosophy, human nature, and life's great mysteries. Paintings on the walls hinted at a man who was introspective, perhaps lonely, but thoughtful. And then she found something unexpected, a journal. It was tucked away in a drawer, simple and unassuming. She hesitated at first, unsure if she should open it, but her curiosity got the better of her. Inside were pages filled with Mr. Charles's handwriting. The entries were a mix of musings on life, reflections on the people he had encountered, and notes on his thoughts about wealth and its impact on the world. He wrote about the disconnect he felt between his fortune and the people around him, about the superficial relationships that came with money, and the isolation it created. But there was one entry that stood out more than the rest. In it, Mr. Charles wrote about a particular waitress at the diner, someone who, in his eyes, represented everything that money couldn't buy: kindness, humility, and a sense of groundedness that he had long since lost. He didn't mention her by name, but the description was unmistakable. He wrote about how her small acts of kindness had affected him in ways she could never understand. Her ability to see people as they were, without judgment or expectation, had left a deep impression on him. In his own way, he had been watching her, not in a predatory or invasive way, but as someone who had come to admire the simplicity and honesty of her life. He had seen in her what he had always longed for, a genuine connection untainted by wealth or status. Reading his words, she felt a strange mix of emotions. It was both humbling and overwhelming to realize that she had made such an impact on someone without ever knowing it. Mr. Charles hadn't chosen her at random. He had seen something in her that reminded him of the life he had once had, before his wealth had isolated him from the world. His decision to leave her everything wasn't a simple act of generosity. It was his way of passing on a chance to someone who he believed could handle it with grace and wisdom. In that moment, she understood that the fortune wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility. With this newfound understanding, she began to see the fortune in a different light. Yes, the money had brought chaos into her life, but it had also given her an opportunity. She no longer felt like the confused waitress who had been thrown into a whirlwind of unwanted attention. She now saw herself as someone who had the chance to create real change, not only for herself, but for others as well. But with that realization came the weight of responsibility. What was she going to do with all this money? How was she going to use it in a way that honored Mr. Charles's legacy, while also staying true to herself? She knew she couldn't go back to her old life, but she wasn't ready to embrace the extravagant lifestyle that came with her new wealth either. The idea of buying luxury cars, fancy houses, or designer clothes felt empty and hollow. That wasn't who she was, and it never would be. Instead, she decided to take her time. she would figure out what to do with the money on her own terms, without the pressure of the media or the expectations of others. She began meeting with financial advisors, lawyers, and philanthropic experts to explore her options. She wanted to be smart about it, to make decisions that would have a lasting impact. At the same time, she started to reconnect with the people in her life, but this time with a clearer sense of boundaries. She had learned who she could trust and who she needed to distance herself from. Slowly, she began to rebuild her relationships, making it clear that she wasn't just a source of money for others. She wanted real connections, genuine friendships, and that meant setting limits, even if it was uncomfortable at times. She also started to make plans for her future. She didn't want the money to change her completely, but she did want it to help her create the life she had always dreamed of. She thought about the causes that mattered to her, the people she could help, and the ways she could give back. The fortune wasn't just a burden anymore. It was an opportunity for a new beginning. As time passed, the true weight of the fortune began to settle in. It wasn't just the amount of money itself, but the endless decisions that came with it. The reality of managing such an immense sum started to feel more like a full-time job than a gift. The novelty of her new life quickly wore off as she was faced with a series of challenges she could never have anticipated. It wasn't as simple as just having money. It was about what to do with it, how to navigate the endless complications, and how to keep her life from spiraling out of control. One of the first hurdles she encountered was the barrage of legal complications. Mr. Charles's fortune, though officially left to her, was tied up in various investments, properties, and business dealings that she knew nothing about. There were taxes, inheritances laws, and financial agreements that required careful navigation. She was thrust into meetings with attorneys and financial advisors, some of whom spoke in a language she barely understood, using jargon that left her feeling more confused than ever. She quickly realized that money came with its own bureaucracy, a system of regulations and paperwork that seemed designed to overwhelm anyone who wasn't prepared. The lawyers assured her that they would take care of everything, but she couldn't help feeling like a passive bystander in her own life. It was as if she had lost control over her own decisions, with every choice being filtered through layers of professionals who all had their own agendas. Some wanted her to invest in certain portfolios. Others pushed her toward real estate, while a few hinted at starting charitable foundations in her name. Everyone seemed to have a plan for her money, and they presented their ideas with such confidence that she began to doubt her own instincts. At the same time, the financial side of her inheritance brought new challenges. She had never had to manage money on this scale before, and it quickly became overwhelming. Even simple tasks like paying bills or managing her accounts had become more complicated. She had to hire an accountant just to keep track of everything, and the layers of responsibility began to pile up. She could no longer just check her balance at the ATM. Now she had to think about investment strategies, tax shelters, charitable donations, and estate planning. It felt like the money was running her life rather than the other way around. But the money didn't just bring financial complications. It also altered her relationships in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had already dealt with the initial wave of people asking for money, but as time went on, the dynamics continued to shift. Some people in her life, particularly friends and family, seemed to think she now had an endless supply of resources to share. They came to her with their problems, medical bills, mortgages, college tuition, and while she wanted to help, she realized she couldn't solve everyone's problems without losing herself in the process. She quickly learned that saying no was one of the hardest things she had ever had to do. Turning down a family member or close friend, especially when they were in need, left her feeling guilty and conflicted. But she also knew that if she started giving money to everyone who asked, it would never end. The requests would keep coming, and she would be seen less as a person and more as a bank. It was a painful lesson, But she came to understand that the money couldn't and shouldn't be the solution to every problem. Yet, with every no came consequences. Some relationships grew distant, strained by resentment or disappointment. People who had once been close to her now seemed distant or outright hostile, as though her refusal to share her fortune had somehow betrayed their trust. The loss of these connections weighed on her, but she knew she had to stand firm. The money had already complicated her life in ways she had never expected, and she couldn't let it dictate her relationships too. In addition to these personal challenges, there were also more sinister forces at play. With wealth came attention from people she had never encountered before, shady individuals with questionable motives. Scammers started targeting her, sending fraudulent emails or showing up unannounced, pretending to be people they weren't. She even received threatening letters with demands for money and thinly veiled threats of what might happen if she didn't comply. These were people who saw her as an easy mark, someone who had come into money without knowing how to protect herself. It became clear that she needed security, not just for her finances, but for her own safety. This realization brought a new level of anxiety into her life. She hired a security team and had to install surveillance at her home, turning what had once been a peaceful existence into a fortress of caution. The freedom that had once defined her life was now restricted by the fear that someone might take advantage of her or worse. The constant vigilance was exhausting, and the sense of paranoia that followed her every move began to feel like a prison. But despite the difficulties, the struggles, and the unexpected challenges, she was determined not to let the money control her. She knew that at some point, she had to reclaim her life, to take the fortune that had been left to her, and use it in a way that felt meaningful and true to who she was. She had seen firsthand the dangers of letting wealth dictate your life. She had watched Mr. Charles, a man who had everything, live a lonely, isolated existence. She refused to let that be her fate. Instead, she began to think about how the money could be used to create something good, something lasting. She started small, with causes that were close to her heart: local charities, food banks, shelters for those in need. She didn't just want to write checks. She wanted to be involved, to see firsthand the impact of her donations. She spent time volunteering, working side by side with people who were doing real, tangible work in the community. It was during these moments that she felt a sense of purpose returning to her life, a reminder that money could be a tool for positive change if used thoughtfully. As her confidence grew, so did her ambitions. She began to research larger philanthropic endeavors, learning from experts in the field about how to create lasting impact through giving. She didn't just want to be another rich person throwing money at problems. She wanted to build something sustainable, something that would continue to benefit people long after she was gone. She considered starting a foundation, one that would focus on causes that mattered to her: education, homelessness, mental health. But she wanted to do it on her own terms, without the pressure of public expectations or the need for recognition. In addition to her charitable work, she also began to think about her own future. She realized that while she wanted to give back, she also needed to take care of herself. For years, she had put her own dreams on hold, focusing on the day-to-day grind of making ends meet. Now, for the first time in her life, she had the freedom to think about what she wanted. She explored new hobbies, took trips to places she had always dreamed of visiting, and invested in her own personal growth. She signed up for classes, studied topics she had always been interested in, and began to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried beneath the weight of financial struggle. As the months turned into years, she found a balance. The money no longer felt like a burden, but rather a tool she could use to live a meaningful life. She surrounded herself with people she trusted, real friends, not just those interested in her wealth. Her relationships, though fewer in number, were stronger and more genuine. She had learned how to set boundaries, how to say no when necessary, and how to protect herself without closing herself off to the world. In the end, the fortune that had once threatened to overwhelm her became a source of empowerment. She had taken control of her own narrative, crafting a life that was rich in experiences, in connections, and in purpose. The money no longer defined her. It was simply a part of her story, one that she had written on her own terms. Looking back, she often thought about Mr. Charles, the man who had seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. His gift had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined, but it was his quiet wisdom that had left the deepest mark. He had understood, in a way few others could, that wealth alone could not bring happiness or fulfillment. It was the choices she made, the values she held, and the connections she nurtured that truly defined her life. With that knowledge, she stepped forward into a future of her own making, one that honored the past, but wasn't bound by it. She was no longer just the waitress who had inherited a fortune. She was a woman who had learned how to navigate the complexities of wealth, of relationships, and of life itself, emerging stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make her mark on the world.